I have been hunting with my father since I was 9 years old, and I am 38 now, which means I have spent close to 3 decades moving through forests and wilderness in a specific way, which is different from hiking or camping because it requires a level of stillness, silence, and attention to your environment that most people can never develop. I know what a forest sounds like when it is operating normally and when something has changed it, when a predator has moved through an area, when weather is approaching, and when something is present that should not be there. I want to establish that specific fluency before I tell you what happened on a solo hunting trip to the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri 3 autumns ago, because what I noticed was something that my years of experience allowed me to notice, and that a less experienced person in the same situation might have missed entirely, and missing it would have been significantly worse. I set up a climbing tree stand in the late evening, about 40 feet up in a white oak on a ridge overlooking a creek drainage that I had scouted the previous spring and that showed significant deer sign. It was the second evening of a 4-day solo trip. Camp was about a mile back through the timber. No other hunters were there in the area as far as I knew, and the nearest road was 6 miles away by trail. The kind of setup I had done many times. Everything familiar and comfortable. The deer movement that evening was good. I had seen 3 does before sunset and had passed on them looking for a mature buck, and by the time legal shooting light ended, I was feeling good about the spot and thinking about the walk back to camp. I gave myself about 20 minutes after dark to let any deer that might have been nearby settle before I started climbing down, standard practice, and I sat up there in the dark with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust and listening to the creek drainage below me. That is when I noticed the silence. I want to explain what I mean precisely because the word silence does not fully capture it. A forest at night is not silent. It is a specific, layered collection of sounds that you learn to read the way you learn to read a page of text, individual elements contributing to an overall meaning. The creek running over rocks, wind in the upper canopy, the periodic sound of a squirrel adjusting position on a branch, the great horned owls that had been calling across the drainage since dark. What I noticed at approximately 15 minutes after dark was that every one of those elements had stopped at the same moment, not faded sequentially, the way sounds fade when an animal moves through and disrupts an area, but stopped, as though a switch had been thrown. The creek was still running, but I had stopped being able to hear it despite having heard it clearly for the previous 3 hours from that same position. The owls had stopped. The wind had stopped. The squirrel sounds had stopped. Everything had stopped simultaneously, and what remained was a quality of silence I had never encountered in a forest in close to 30 years of being in them. I have read accounts of experienced hunters and outdoors people describing this phenomenon, a forest going completely quiet all at once, and the consistent description is that it produces a specific kind of fear that is different from the fear of a specific visible threat. It is the fear of something you cannot identify, something that has changed your environment in a way you cannot account for, and it arrives before your conscious mind has processed what your body has already recognized. My body had already recognized it before I had formed any thought about what was happening. My hand was on my bow and I was scanning the drainage below me before I was aware of having made those decisions. I sat in the stand for a long time without moving. I do not know exactly how long. Long enough that I became aware of how careful I was being about my own breathing, keeping it slow and quiet, which was not a conscious decision. Long enough that my eyes had fully adjusted and I could make out the shapes of the trees around me in the available starlight and the pale shape of the creek bank below. The silence continued. Nothing came back. Then I saw the light. It was below me in the creek drainage, maybe 80 yards from the base of my tree, moving slowly along the far creek bank. Not a flashlight beam, not any artificial light I have used in a forest, not the headlamp quality or the lantern quality or the phone light quality that I knew from experience. A pale light with a diffuse quality, not casting shadows the way a directed beam casts shadows, but illuminating the immediate area around it from within, moving at a slow and consistent walking pace along the far creek bank in the direction from which the creek flowed. I watched it for a long time, from 40 feet up in the white oak. It moved along the far bank for what I estimate was about 4 minutes, slow and consistent, and then it stopped. When it stopped, it was approximately directly across the creek from the base of my tree, and it stayed there. I am not going to tell you how long I sat 40 feet up in that tree stand watching a light that was not any light I recognized on the far bank of a creek in complete silence, because the actual duration is embarrassing and also irrelevant. What matters is that it was long enough for me to consider and discard every explanation I could produce. Other hunters. No other hunters were permitted in that specific unit on that specific day. I had checked, and even if one had been poaching the area, a hunter does not move with a light that illuminates from within rather than projecting a beam. And a hunter who becomes aware of another person in the area does not stop directly across the creek from them and remain stationary. Hikers or other recreation users. The nearest trail was 6 miles away through difficult terrain in the dark. Not impossible, but enormously unlikely, and the same light quality argument applied. Bioluminescence. I had seen foxfire, the bioluminescent glow of fungal mycelium in decaying wood, many times in forest environments. Foxfire is stationary. It does not move along a creek bank at walking pace. I could not produce an explanation that accounted for the specific combination of characteristics I was observing, and I had been trying to produce one for long enough that I was past the stage of trying. I was at the stage of deciding what to do. Climbing down from the tree stand required the mechanical sounds of the stand's climbing mechanism, which would have announced my presence and location clearly to anything in the drainage. I had no way to descend silently. I had my bow, my headlamp, and my pack, and camp was a mile away through timber that I would need the headlamp to navigate. I made the decision to climb down. I do not know if it was the right decision, but it was the only one I could make, because staying in the stand until something resolved itself was not a real option. I started the descent as slowly and as quietly as the stand's mechanism allowed, which was not quietly. The sounds of the descent filled the drainage, and I watched the light on the far bank the entire time I was coming down, and the light did not move during my descent. When I reached the ground, I turned my headlamp on immediately and oriented myself and started toward camp without looking back for approximately 50 yards. At 50 yards, I stopped and turned and looked back at the creek drainage. The light on the far bank was gone. The forest sounds had resumed. The creek was audible. An owl called from somewhere up the drainage. Everything had returned to normal as completely and as simultaneously as it had stopped. The walk back to camp was the longest mile I have covered in 30 years of moving through forests at night. I am not a person who is made uncomfortable by dark timber, and I was uncomfortable for that entire mile in a way that I could not fully articulate then and cannot fully articulate now, except to say that the specific sensation was one of being observed. Not the general awareness of a forest's aliveness that I was accustomed to, but the specific sensation of a directed intelligence paying attention to my movement in a way that felt deliberate and tracking. I reached camp and I did not build a fire. I got in the tent and I lay there and I thought about the light on the far creek bank and the silence that preceded it and the return to normal that followed my departure, and I was still thinking about it when I fell asleep several hours later. I did not hunt the next 2 days from that stand. I moved to a different part of the unit and hunted from the ground and had an unremarkable and completely normal experience for the remaining time. I broke camp on the 4th morning and walked out, and when I reached my truck, I sat in it for a few minutes before starting the engine. I have told this account to 2 people, my father and a friend who had hunted the Ozarks for decades longer than I had. My father said he had heard accounts of lights in the Ozark drainage bottoms from people whose credibility he did not question, and that his advice was to not go back to that specific drainage and to leave whatever was there alone. My friend said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about, which was that in his experience the lights in bottomland drainages in southern Missouri were older than any explanation anyone had tried to give them, and that the consistent feature of every account he had heard was that the light stopped and oriented toward the observer at some point during the encounter. The light I watched from 40 feet up in the white oak stopped directly across the creek from my tree and remained stationary for an extended period. I had not thought about that specific detail in the framework of what my friend described until he said it, and once he said it, I could not think about it in any other framework. I still hunt. I was back in the Ozarks the following season, a different unit, a different drainage. I have not returned to that specific ridge, and I do not plan to. Some country earns a specific kind of respect that amounts to leaving it alone, and that particular mile of creek bottom in southern Missouri has earned exactly that from me, which is the first time in 30 years of hunting that I have made that specific decision about a piece of ground, and the last time I expect to need to make it. My aunt and uncle have a horse farm in central Kentucky, about 40 acres of rolling pasture with a barn complex and a farmhouse at the end of a county road that ends at their property. They breed and train quarter horses and have been doing it for 20 years. I have spent time there every summer since I was a kid, and I know the property the way. I know my own neighborhood, every fence line, every gate, even every particular sound the barn makes at different hours and in different weather. When they asked me to stay at the farm for 10 days while they took their first real vacation in years, I said yes without hesitation because I very well knew the place, and I trusted myself to handle whatever routine farm management required for 10 days. Horses are not quiet animals even when they are settled for the night. They shift their weight, they move in their stalls, they make low sounds that carry through a barn wall clearly if you are close to the structure. I had slept in the farmhouse adjacent to that barn complex for portions of every summer for 15 years, and I knew exactly what the horses sounded like while they are at rest and when something was wrong. It was my 6th night at the property, a Wednesday in late July, and I had been in bed since about 10, watching something on my phone with my window open because the Kentucky summer heat made sleeping without airflow difficult. The window faced the barn complex, about 60 feet from the house, and at some point around 11:30 I noticed that the horses had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of settled animals. When horses are comfortable and resting, there is still ambient sound, the occasional shifting, a low vocalization, the sound of movement in stall bedding. What I was hearing, or specifically not hearing, was the complete absence of those sounds, the specific quality of horses that have stopped what they were doing and are holding still. I got up and looked out the window at the barn. The exterior barn light was on, the one my aunt kept on a timer for security, and it illuminated the barn's front face and the paddock area in front of it. Everything looked correct from that distance. Gates closed, paddock empty, barn door in its normal position. I stood at the window for a few minutes and the horses remained quiet. Then I heard one of them, the oldest mare, my aunt called June, make a sound I had heard her make exactly twice before in 15 years. A sharp, sustained exhalation that was not quite a snort and not quite a whinny, but something between them that June produced specifically when she was frightened rather than just alert. I put my shoes on. I want to be clear that I went outside, not because I thought something was definitely wrong, but because June's specific vocalization was unusual enough that I felt I should check. I brought my phone for the flashlight. The night was warm and still, and the only sounds outside were insects until I got within about 20 feet of the barn door and heard something inside that stopped me in place. It was a voice. Low, male, coming from inside the barn. Not the sound of someone who had gotten in accidentally or was in distress, not a sound that had an obvious, innocent explanation. A low, deliberate voice from inside my aunt's locked barn at 11:30 at night. I did not go in. I want to be specific about that decision because I made it consciously, and I believe it was correct. I was alone on a 40-acre property at the end of a dead-end county road at night, with no one else within visible distance, and there was at minimum one person in the barn who had no business being there. Going through the barn door alone would have put me in an enclosed space with an unknown number of people I could not see. I backed away from the barn quietly and went back to the house and went upstairs and looked out the window from the better vantage point of the second floor. From the second floor window, I could see not just the barn front, but the side paddock that ran along the barn's east wall. There was a truck parked in the side paddock, not visible from the ground floor window because the paddock gate position blocked that sight line, but clearly visible from above. An older pickup, dark colored, parked inside the paddock with its lights off and its engine apparently not running. I had not heard it arrive, and I had not heard the paddock gate open. which meant it had been there before I noticed the horses had gone quiet, possibly for a significant period before that. I watched from the second floor window for close to 20 minutes. During that time, I saw two things that I am going to describe as precisely as I can. The first was a man coming out of the side entrance of the barn, the smaller door on the east wall that opened directly into the paddock, carrying something over his shoulder. The barn light did not reach the paddock side well enough for me to identify what he was carrying, but the way he was carrying it and the effort it appeared to require suggested significant weight. He walked to the truck and put whatever he was carrying in the truck bed and went back into the barn. The second thing was a different man appearing at the paddock gate and checking the county road in both directions before returning to the truck without getting in. Just checking the road, quietly and methodically. The behavior of someone keeping watch. I called my uncle in Florida. He answered on the third ring, sounding concerned because I had never called him in the middle of the night during the 10 days and he knew something was wrong. I described what I was seeing, the truck in the paddock, the men going in and out of the barn, the man checking the road. He told me to stay in the house with the doors locked and that he was going to call his neighbor, a man named Gary who lived about a mile down the road and who had a key to the property and who my uncle trusted. He told me not to go outside again. Gary arrived in his own truck about 15 minutes later, pulling up the county road and into the driveway without hesitation, his headlights sweeping the property and his truck lights illuminating the paddock area in a way that my second floor window view could not. I was still at the window and I saw the dark truck in the paddock start its engine, the exhaust visible in Gary's headlights, and back out of the paddock through the gate that was apparently already open. It pulled onto the county road and accelerated away from the property in the direction away from the main route, back into the county roads, and was gone. Gary came to the house and I let him in, and we went to the barn together and turned on all the lights. The horses were agitated, all 6 of them moving in their stalls, which was unusual for that hour, and June was at the back of her stall with her head low, which my aunt would later tell me was a posture June took when she was stressed. Someone had been through the barn systematically. Halters and lead ropes that were usually hung on specific hooks were in different positions. The feed room door, which my aunt kept padlocked, had its padlock on the floor with its shackle open, meaning someone had picked it or had a key. The feed room itself had been gone through. Bins and equipment moved, things not as my aunt had left them. Most importantly, and this is what my uncle focused on when we spoke the following morning, one of the younger horses, a 3-year-old gelding my uncle had recently acquired and who had not yet been registered formally and therefore had no visible identifying paperwork on the premises, was in his stall but seemed wrong. Gary, who had been around horses his entire life, noticed it before I did. He was standing in the wrong position in his stall, too far toward the back wall, and when Gary went in to check on him, he found a mark on the horse's neck that Gary said looked like a sedation injection site. The horse was not behaving normally. My uncle flew home the following morning, cutting the vacation short. The veterinarian confirmed the injection site and confirmed the horse had been sedated, and my uncle's theory, which Gary agreed with, was that the people in the barn had been in the process of loading the horse into the truck when Gary's arrival had interrupted them. They had likely sedated the horse to make loading easier and had been working on getting him out when the headlights in the driveway changed their calculation. Horse theft is not a dramatic crime in the way that other farm crimes sometimes appear in the news, but it is a real and specific crime that happens in horse farming communities, and a valuable young, unregistered horse without clear identifying paperwork on the premises is a target in a specific way. My uncle had a security system installed within a week of returning. What I have thought about since is the window at the second floor. If I had stayed at the ground floor window, I would not have seen the truck in the paddock. I would have heard the voice in the barn and retreated to the house and called my uncle without a clear picture of what was happening and without the specific information about the truck and the second person watching the road. The second floor view was what allowed my uncle to call Gary with enough information for Gary to arrive and do what he did, which was show up with headlights that changed the calculation for whoever was in that paddock. I stayed the remaining 4 days and finished the farm sitting. The horse recovered fully within 24 hours. June was back to her normal behavior by the following evening. But I check every paddock gate and every barn door twice before I go to bed now when I'm at that property, and I keep my phone on and charged and within reach. And I have Gary's number saved where I can find it without searching. And when the horses go quiet in the way that settled horses do not go quiet, I go to the second floor window first before I do anything else, because the difference between what I could see from one floor and what I could see from the other is the difference between the whole story and only part of it.